What time is it? Say it's time for KP's Video News. KP's Video News. It's KP's Video News, y'all. It's KP's Video News, y'all. That's right, it's KP's Video News. And I got a lot to cover here on this topic. And this is about the history of the cops in the United States and the deception that's going on right now. I mean, there's some major deception going on right now. And, so in order for me to get to where I need to be at the end of this story, I have to start from the beginning on how and why policing and cops even exist, especially here in the United States. So I got to let me do their history here, and the history of the police and what they do goes all the way back to the slave catchers, and the slave catchers were people who returned escaped slaves to their owners in the United States before slavery was abolished at the end of the Civil War. And this is one of the reasons why black people in the United States are treated the way they are treated. This goes all the way back to then. So colonial times saw the emergence of local law enforcement squads. In the North, these were the watchmen. Remember that name, the watchmen, who were paid small fees by private citizens to police the streets and maintain order in their areas. The first groups in the South were slave patrols, which were made up of both slave owners and non-slave owners, and were also paid by private citizens. However, the parcels of land in the South were much larger and therefore much harder to patrol. Groups that had focused on slave hunting were more prevalent in the South, as the majority of slave owners resided there. Contrary to popular belief, slave patrols were not composed solely of men. Women who owned slaves also took part, but no case of free blacks hunting slaves was recorded in the United States. Nearly any prospecting individual could set out to be a slave hunter, but few were able to find much success. The Southern law enforcement groups were created out of a need to maintain order among slaves and slave owners, rather than to protect the interests of the common non-slaving people. Many Southern slave owners were considered irresponsible if their charges were allowed to escape, and it was a fear that more escapes would upend the system if not met with retribution. It was believed to be in the general interest of slave owners to maintain discipline so that slaves did not have the chance to start uprising. The first slave patrollers began their work in the Caribbean during the 16th and 17th centuries. They were primarily English and Spanish colonialists and colonists who volunteered in order to keep a handle on the growing number of slaves. They were not terribly successful as their territories were large and difficult to police. Consequently, many slaves were able to escape to the north, but abolitionists and local governments sheltered them. Many states allowed local enforcement to enlist the help of the federal marshals, U.S. commissioners, and other local citizens to spread to more states. With the ratification of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, this is what they did. They used fear in order to spread the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required all citizens and local law enforcement to aid in the capture of runaway slaves. This meant that Northerners and abolitionists were forced to comply with slave hunters, although they often found ways to evade the policy. Up until this point, many states did their best to thwart slave catchers by passing decrees such as Massachusetts' Personal Liberty Statute of 1842, which barred slave catchers from seeking the aid of state officials. However, the Fugitive Act of 1850 nullified these former efforts, and abolitionists were forced to resort to small acts of defiance instead. In many areas, it could actually be dangerous to be part of a slave catching group due to the hostile of the locals. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, slave hunters could easily obtain an order of removal which approved the return of a runaway slave. However, these orders were often met with resistance from northern abolitionists who tried to intervene by blocking entry to the room where the fugitive was being held. During the Civil War, these enforcement groups met with great difficulty, primarily because of most of the white men were all fighting in the war. With the men gone, the duty to keep slaves in line fell on the women, who also had households to run. Lack of punishment and greater likelihood of successful escape caused more and more slaves to run away. With slave patrols stretched so thin, many slaves were able to escape and were often aided by enemy invaders. Many of the slaves joined the Union ranks, the United States colored troops taking up arms against their former owners. And that was one group you had, and those were the law enforcement. Then you had the mercenaries that came into play in the southern states. Any person could capture an escaped slave and turn them over to law enforcement to receive compensation, and slave owners could also put out advertisements promising a reward for anyone who captured their slaves. Slave owners also hired people to make who made a living catching fugitive slaves. Since these slave catchers charged by the day and mile, many of them would travel long distances to hunt for fugitives. Slave catchers often used tracking dogs to sniff out their targets, similar to the police dogs they use today. These were called Negro dogs, and though they could be of multiple breeds, they were typically bloodhounds. However, hiring people to catch slaves was the most effective if the slave catcher was in close proximity, as if they were not, they would have less of a chance of staying on the escaped slaves trail. Slaves reaching the northern states, which did not recognize slavery as valid, made the slave catcher's job substantially more difficult. Even if they did find a fugitive, they were likely to face resistance from anti-slavery citizens if a slave managed to escape this far. Slave owners typically sent an agent more closely connected to them or put out notices about the escaped slave. So that's the first part, where you have to understand the roots of where this whole police system came into play. And another aspect of the police situation came into play, and this is the early police in the United States inherited England's Anglo-Saxon common law and its system of social obligation. Sheriffs, constables, watchmen, what that word is again, watchmen, and stipend justice. And stipend justice means paid justice. As both societies became less rural and agrarian and more urban and industrialized, crime, riots, and other public disturbances became more common. So one of the main reasons for the early police that were created in the North was basically to keep certain groups of people under control, and that was like workers, basically workers that decided, well, they didn't want to work for anymore for this slave labor, the slave little pennies that they were getting paid, and then they would revolt against the owners of these big businesses and big companies, and the big companies created private cops to basically beat them back in the submission, beat them up and force them to go back to work. So this is the history of the cops in the United States. However, yet Americans, like the English, were wary of creating standing police forces. Among the first public police forces established in colonial North America were the Watchmen, organized in Boston. These are the ones I'm talking about, in 1631, and in New Amsterdam, later called New York, in 1647. Although watchmen were paid a fee in both Boston and New York, most officers in colonial America did not receive a salary, but were paid by private citizens, as were the English counterparts. In the frontier regions of the United States in the late 18th and 19th centuries, there arose a novel form of the Saxon tradition and the Frank pledge, the vigilante, in areas where formal justice system had yet to be established or the rudimentary policing apparatus had proved inadequate in the face of rampant crime. It was not common for citizens called vigilantes or regulators to band together in communities of vigilance to combat crime and introduce order where none existed, basically a lynch mob. These socially constructive forms of vigilantism, lawlessness on behalf of lawfulness, and the question of when and where it degenerated into the rank mob rule, that's lynch mobs, has been popular topic for American history. Beginning in the early 19th century, large numbers of immigrants from Germany and Ireland settled in the steadily growing urban centers of New York and Boston. Their cultures and lifestyles initially offended the sensibilities of Americans whose families, mainly from England and the Netherlands, had settled in the country in the previous century or earlier. Indeed, the existence of large immigrant populations in the crowded cities of the East was perceived as a threat to the very fabric of American society. Eventually, the political, economic, and social dominance of Americans of English and Dutch extractions was eroded. Meanwhile, crime, rioting, and other disturbances became endemic in these cities. The American response to growing urban unrest was twofold. Versions of the constable and the night watch system, the watchmen, were tried, and voluntary citizens groups were encouraged to try to solve urban problems. Reformers distributed religious tracts and Bibles, started Sunday schools, created such organizations as the Young Men's Christians Association, the YMCA, and presented themselves as moral examples to immigrants and poor. By the mid-19th century, middle-class frustration with the deterioration of the cities had led to the passage of laws regulating public behavior and creating new public institutions of social control and coercion, ergo penitentiaries, asylums, and police forces. The first police department in the United States was established in New York in 1844. It was officially organized in 1845. Other cities soon followed suit. New Orleans and Cincinnati in 1852, Boston and Philadelphia in 1854, Chicago and Milwaukee in 1855, Baltimore and Newark, New Jersey in 1857. These early departments all used the London metropolitan system as a model. Like the metropolitan system police, American police were organized in a quasi-military command structure similar to the Army. Their main task was the prevention of crime and disorder, and they provided a wide array of other public services. There were no detectives. In part, because of an ideology committed to local control over most institutions, police power in the United States became the province of state and local governments, and each city established its own police department. The authority for policing was decentralized to the level of political wards and neighborhoods, which developed relatively autonomous police units. The police established intimate relations with the neighborhoods and neighborhood leaders, and initially did not even wear uniforms. Middle and upper class reformers believed that one of the primary tasks, I'm going to say this slowly, the middle and upper class reformers, people that are trying to form and try to keep people in a certain position or class status, believed that one of the primary tasks of the police was to reestablish political and social control over a population racked by ethnic and economic rivalries. These tensions between being closely linked to communities and being an instrument for reforming them inevitably resulted in a struggle for political control of the police, a struggle that was one of the dominant themes in the history of the police in the United States. So now you got the history of, basically I'm not going to do that whole entire history, but one of the, I'm going to do this little one story here, and then then I'm going to go on to the last part of this. In the response to the interjurisdictional crime waves of the second half of the 19th century, states enacted laws giving many business corporations the authority to create their own private police forces or to contract with the established police agencies in the city. The Coal and Iron Police of Pennsylvania was a company police force that later became notorious for its anti-labor vigilantism. The most famous independent police force was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and the Pinkerton still exists right to this day. Created in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton, a political fugitive from Scotland, he was a criminal, whose father was a police sergeant. The Pinkerton's agency provided a wide array of private detective services and specialized in protecting trains, apprehend train robbers, and strike breaking and other activities directed against labor unions. So the Pinkertons were involved in a mass shootout in Boston one time at the train yards in Boston, where they just opened fire on a lot of guys that were trying to form unions there. So all that, what I've been talking about is leading up to where I'm going with this story. This is where I'm going with this particular story here, and the reason why I'm doing this is because this is where we're at right now. This is where we're at right now, and fast forward till today, and this is one of the main reasons why you see what's going on in several cities of the United States. But since Black Lives Matter and several police reform groups have called for the defunding and the disbanding of police forces around the United States, a lot is at stake for the police departments in America. They stand to lose billions of dollars, and to make sure that they don't lose that money and to make sure that this does not happen, the police departments have responded with a campaign from the top down to preserve the police department by any cost, and even at the lives of black citizens and children. These shootings in Chicago, New York, and Atlanta specifically have not all been black on black related crimes. That's what they want you to believe. These entities will go to any length to keep that funding, even if it means killing blacks and Hispanics to create a feeling that crime is out of control. Due to your calling for the defunding of the police department, it has created and came up with a fear tactic that has been used for over 400 years in America to make blacks look and other minorities look like they're the worst and the most dangerous people on the earth, and that they use that fear tactic to get you to follow and go along with their garbage. Police respond to the fear, and the people respond to that fear that the people, the police and the politicians throw out there. The citizens respond to that fear, and then they throw their support behind the corrupt system that has been killing with immunity for a long, long time in the United States. It's time for real police reform. And so when you turn loose those heavily armed cops with no restraint on the citizens, it's like turning the army loose on the cities that they patrol. And I spoke out about this before, about the hiring of these guys that are coming straight back from Iraq and Afghanistan. That you hiring these guys that still got murder and killing on their minds, and they don't have enough time to get all of this garbage out of their heads. So therefore, they're coming straight out of the military, You're putting them in police uniforms, and then you turn them loose on the inner city, and they look at the people in the inner city as the enemy. So anyway, and this is a sidebar here. In the late 1980s, what the LAPD did in Los Angeles was they hired large groups of young-looking black cops. They were all rookie cops, and initially they used them to infiltrate the high schools, and specifically Crenshaw High School in Los Angeles. They put these young cops, and they had them check into the school as students, and basically for drug busts, and they made several arrests inside Crenshaw High School. These are young-looking cops, but a judge threw out every case, because what they had did was basically entice these kids to get them drugs, and they framed the kids. So the judge threw out every case, and they disbanded that. But what they did was they took those same young-looking rookie cops, and they were used after the Rodney King riots. They used them to restart the violence in L.A. because they would just say, like, they had a truce in L.A. between the Bloods and the Crips after the Rodney King riots. So the cops were like, first thing they said was, no, it's not going to work. So they didn't want it to work. So what they did was they took those same young-looking cops, and they would arrest a gang member and take his car. So they would take his car, take him to jail, take his car, which is probably a lowrider, take his car, and they would load that car up with young-looking, black rookie cops, dressed up in, just say they got on all red. The guy that they arrested was a Blood, so they got these young cops dressed up in all red, and they got him in his car, and then they would go out in a rival neighborhood. They go out in a Crip neighborhood and do a drive-by shooting. Even if they wasn't trying to shoot at anybody in particular, they would shoot guns and shoot the guns in the air, and then yell out some gang names and all this stuff. So basically, they did that, and the treaty between the Bloods and the Crips was already fragile as it was. It was just getting started, and everything was just really fragile. So they were successful in getting these guys to start their feud all over again. And now that was the cops that did that. LAPD did that, and it's confirmed because basically the black community is closer than the police thought, because it was like, if you had a Blood over here and a Crip over there, those people got relatives. They're related some kind of way. So they just confirm notes and put their notes together and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? And they figured it out. So now they got another good truce going on, and they're seriously working on another truce in LA right now. And so, hey, I hope you guys are successful with that. And I know my boy Skip Townsend over there in Los Angeles is trying to do something with that, and he's working very, very diligently to help. He's doing things to help get a truce going on between the blacks and the Hispanics, and and also to stop the black-on-black crime. So I kind of got sided there, but back to where back on track to what I'm really my whole point. And this is my whole point of talking about the history of the cops up to now and what's going on now, and basically it's in New York and Chicago and in Atlanta. It's not all black on black crime. That's not what's going on. That's all of these shootings that are going on. That is not all black on black crime, and they'll use any tactic to make you think that it is, even at the point of grabbing criminals off the street and basically, if you catch somebody with some drugs, you're gonna basically force them to go out and do a little drive-by shooting in a neighborhood Otherwise, with the retribution is saying, okay, if you don't do it, we're going to take you to jail. We're going to lock you up for these drugs. So it's a lot of things, Then you got those mercenaries out there for hire that will go out and they'll do anything for money, including killing your kids, little girls, little boys included. So it's not all black on black crime, but it's being made to look that way. It's being made to look like it's black on black crime, so they can continue and so they can keep those billions and billions of dollars that the cops are, basically giving yearly. They get these budgets, man, these big, huge budgets. And so, they want to keep that money coming in. So if that means killing a few black folks, they could care less, as long as they keep that cash coming in. So don't be stupid your whole life in thinking that these guys walk on water, because they don't. And it's a major deception going on right now in New York, Chicago, and ATL specifically, and in other cities where you have these vigilantes that are going out there killing black people, and to instill that fear in the population, into the citizens, so they can keep this money and keep these police forces from being disbanded and defunded. So wake up, folks. What time is it? Say it's time for KP's Video News. You can take it or you can leave it alone. KP's Video News. It's KP's Video News, y'all. It's KP's Video News, y'all. You can take it or leave it alone. Peace.